flanks of Greenland are now melting much more rapidly than any climatologist's theories. So that sends some of my colleagues into a spin. Well, we don't understand anything, don't say anything. And others say, wait a minute, it's melting faster than any of our theories. Don't you think we ought to warn society? They've got a risk of having to move literally billions of people out of trillions of dollars of infrastructure over the next century or two if we continue on this dangerous pathway?
So you scientists, and I say that respectfully, you can figure out the area of ice in Greenland, right? And you have a formula that tells you that if it melts, what area of water that's going to be distributed, and you have another formula of how it will be distributed. Okay, so you've done all that work.
Well, NASA actually uses satellites. They could take the pictures, and it's funny because Greenland is very massive. You know, if you start melting ice, it actually changes the weight of Greenland. That's enough to make a satellite flying over it move 10 feet, and you can actually measure it and figure out that Greenland is melting. That's how we did it.
Okay. Now, I know we were talking about seas rising, but if Greenland, all that cold water comes in, does that disrupt the different flows of water around the world? Is that a factor? And do we worry about that?
We should. It disrupts where the fresh water is and where the salty water is. That affects fisheries. So it's affecting the ocean food chain, the bottom of the ecology. It also, affects ocean currents. That's important. The most dramatic effect is sea level because that affects our coastlines, whether our ports are viable over time, whether our coastal ecosystems will be destroyed, whether the thousands of years of culture in the small island states in the world where millions of people live will be driven to cultural extinction. The Maldives, in fact, the very clever president, they held an underwater cabinet meeting to dramatize that another 100 years and they're out of business. So those are the kinds of things that we scientists worry about, and we can't help it. We're toilet trained to bury our leads. We say, but we're not sure. It's only maybe a 50% chance. And we therefore give duck and cover to those who say, well, let's wait and see. But what happens if it happens?
Yeah. Okay. So let's say in the next 10, 15, 20 years, do you think seas might rise and have an adverse effect on, let's say, Manhattan?
Seas are continuing to rise.
Yes.
And in the last 30 years, they've kind of increased their rate of rise because they used to rise just from heating the oceans and making them expand. Now you're adding the glacier melt on top of that. Yes, it will influence Manhattan. As storms go by, the flooding will go further inland. And people have redrawn the map, say 200 years from now, you flood the subways. You flood the London subways. We're talking $1 trillion worth of infrastructure.
That could happen 10 years from now?
No, that
20.
would not happen. Here's the problem. What we do in the next 20 to 50 years as a society, where we use the atmosphere as a free sewer to dump our smokestack and tailpipe wastes, could precondition the melting, which might yet take hundreds of years to happen.
Okay.
But unlike Saturday Night Live, remember the old days of Gilda Radner? She would get on there, and in the end, after railing for 20 minutes, she made a mistake and said, never mind. There's no never mind. It's what we call a tipping point. So we have an awesome obligation as this generation to act over long periods of time without being 100% certain that we have to do it.
So we're not going to be flooded instantly.
Not instantly.
But as time goes by, and if we humans continue to pump more carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, your grandson might be facing an extremely different environment in this world than we face right now?
Yes, he lives in the West where we live, and the West has already seen a factor of 500% increase in the area of wildfire the last 30 years, directly related to the combination of warming and people moving where they don't belong. Okay,
so it's clear adverse effects help occur as the seas rise. But what now have you, I hate to say it like that, you scientists, who I admire, what's your proof that this is happening?
Proof for us is accumulated evidence. Have you ever gone to the doctor and you get a diagnosis of a potentially serious disease, and the doctor said, I only wish that we had a definitive test? And you hang around and wait for that lump in your chest to grow, then you know it's metastatic cancer. But if you hang around and wait and it grows, maybe then it'll get out and you'll be dead. So do you do a precautionary treatment? So we do not deal in absolute proof. We deal in preponderance of evidence and risk, and we let the society decide whether to risk it for our life support system.
Give me a little data, because I'd like to make a decision. What data do you have that it's, and how did you collect this data?
So we have this very complicated thing called the climate system, and we can break it into 3 parts: well-established stuff, competing explanations, and still speculative stuff. What's well-established? That we're now 1.4 Fahrenheit, roughly warmer than we were a century and a half ago.
From that, you can calculate expansion of the ocean.
And the oceans and the fires and the other problems. The other thing that we're very, very confident of, but we're not ready to call it unequivocal, we call it very likely, meaning more than 90%, is that in the last 50 years at least, when the warming has really accelerated, that humans are responsible for the bulk of that from dumping their junk in the atmosphere. And the other thing that we're really confident is that even at the level of 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit warming, we can already see damages in rising sea level, intensifying storms, super heat waves, fires, and so forth. And that's at a level that's very low relative to what's coming.
So I sort of heard 2 observable or calculable. What about from the satellites? Can you look down at the surface of the Earth and see that the surface of the Earth is decreasing and the amount of water is increasing? Is that possible?
Well, the amount of sea level rise now is sufficiently small. It's hard to tell the coastline from the satellite. But the satellite tells you that the ocean is taller, that it is in fact expanding. So we have consistent lines of evidence: Greenland melting, tide gauges all around the world, satellites. This is really not pulled out of our left ear. This is observed. And when somebody tells me, I don't believe in global warming, I say, do you believe in evidence?
All right. I believe in evidence. Issue about whether or not the oceans are rising, it's clear. They are rising. And anyone who doesn't think they're rising, anyway. What's the second thing that's very, that science has, to a good extent, proven is happening that is adverse to us, and that convinces you that climate change is really occurring?
There's been a substantial increase in heat waves. Good news is we reduced cold waves a little bit, but the heat waves, in 2003, almost 50,000 people died in Europe. Nobody would have predicted that. If you had asked me, the winter before, how many could you kill in Europe? I would have said, let's see. We killed 500 in Chicago in a heat wave. In 95, Europe's colder, I don't know, 250. We were all wrong because we didn't realize that these were elderly who had walk-ups, and it happened in July when their children were all down in the south of France on vacation and weren't there to help them. So a really weird set of things happened. That's another very direct piece of evidence. The Arctic, that's the floating sea ice, is melting much faster than any of our theories predicted. Greenland is the landed ice. That's where the sea level rise comes from. If you melt the Arctic sea ice, it's not going to make sea level rise. It's like melting an ice cube in your drink isn't going to make it rise. It's dumping in the ice that makes it rise. That's important, not just because it affects polar bears, which are an iconic symbol of nature. It affects the Inuit hunting culture, but it also affects the temperatures around Greenland, which determines the melt rate that determines sea level, which affects billions of people and trillions of dollars of infrastructure.
All right. Now, I may have lost a point here. The second point you're addressing is that the temperature around the Earth is increasing. Is that it? Okay. And one of the ways you know that is because major heat waves that happen in the past, or at least not. Okay, and you do see large chunks of ice, up in the Antarctica, down in the Antarctica, up in the North Pole, Greenland. Okay, so those are observable things. And what about